Hello and welcome to a Song of Ice and Fire miniatures wargame battle report. In this game we're playing a Game of Thrones scenario, and I'm playing Rickard Karstark in Starks versus Theon Greyjoy in Greyjoys. Now, if you're wondering what that miniature on screen is right now, I only have one army. It's my kind of free folk army, but as a little bit of a hobby project over the last year and a bit, I've expanded them using a whole bunch of cyborg miniatures dwarves. Now, this is non-diegetic, but it really does let me play an army that I have always wanted to play. It's vibing on kind of like a Warhammer Fantasy Cracker Drac theme, which are the Norse dwarfs, if you've ever seen those. Yeah, they're not in Song of Ice and Fire, but my community is very understanding, and we actually even have a few other players who've jumped in on the bandwagon. You may see some battle reports that feature something like Dwarfs versus Goblins or Dwarfs versus Skaven, because people are kind of just digging that. As long as it's really clear what everything is, and you are sort of reminding your opponent as needed what your things are, and in my cases I'm actually working on unit labels to make it completely clear, it's in good fun. So I've been really enjoying this kind of thing, and it allows me to play some other factions for things like battle reports. So, as noted, we're playing Starks versus Greyjoys, and the scenario is a Game of Thrones. So here we are at deployment, having set the table up. And let's just go through our armies, table setup, and what's about to happen. On the Greyjoy side, we've got 3 NCUs. They are Windermere, Roderick, and Peter Baelish. And you might sometimes put Eric in there, but really, like, Windermere is an absolute gold standard. And because there's not a huge amount of pillage requirement in the list that my opponent is playing, he's felt comfortable not taking Eric. Eric also has been kind of like recently nerfed. So we're seeing some changes here. Peter Baelish is always a good NCU, and Roderick Harlaw is always a good NCU. But you wouldn't necessarily see Peter in every Greyjoy list because he's kind of edged out by super good Greyjoy NCUs. So his presence here is interesting, and it's going to give my opponent at least one really good play over the course of this game. To complement the 3 NCUs, we have 5 units, which is going to bring this up to an 8 activation list. Now, they're not 100% painted, but to just break down what we've got 1 unit of bowmen here with no attachments, 1 unit of bowmen here with no attachments, a unit of bloody mummers, Theon Greyjoy in House Harlaw Reapers, and then here we have the new Lysene Sellswords, sporting both the 2-point Asha commander with Sentinel and Gang Up, and Qarl for duelist in the list. Now, this unit, Lysene Sellswords, are awesome for 5 points. And this techs them up hugely, but also it does mean that it's a fragile unit that is worth 8 points. So we're going to see how they're going to play. Literally, as I was arriving at the game store, we were finishing a game where they blew through an entire unit of Champions of the Stag and also nearly killed a unit of Stormcrow Archers and nearly killed a unit of Stag Knights. So obviously the unit's high watermark is very high, but will they do as well in this game? Otherwise, what we have here is kind of like a mobility Greyjoy list. Because Theon has diversion tactics and enhanced mobility, and there are sort of like, there's things going on in the list, what my opponent Aaron here has done is he's doubled down on that with the Bloody Mummers for extra mobility. So the center deployment here, what it is aiming for is to be relatively non-committal and to be able to potentially divert force away from the main center. So both of these units here, because Theon has enhanced mobility, which is incredible, could potentially move in this direction or in this direction to really like move around the battlefield and change where the force is centered. It's going to be easy for my opponent to commit onto either this or this objective to score those early with the bowmen. But the problem with the list, obviously, is that it is relatively fragile. It's going to need to play to the fact that it has an activation advantage in this game, because it has 8 units to my 7. It's going to need to play to that activation advantage, because it's not going to want to take a hit. Greyjoy healing is good, but there's nothing in this list that has better than a 5+ save. From my side, I have my Starks deployed down here. We have, from left to right, in the back, Shaggydog, played in this case by a pig. We have a unit of Tully Sworn Shields with no attachments. I love Tully Sworn Shields. I think they're an incredible unit. For 6 points, they're just one of the best ways to spend 6 points in the game. Yes, their offensive output is limited, and yes, Song of Ice and Fire is not a game that really makes great use of the concept of anvil units, in the sense of I will just play hammer and anvil because your opponent will not hit your anvil. But for 6 points, they're just not that expensive. And Song of Ice and Fire is a game that plays well with a concept called a line anchor, where you refuse a flank like I've done here, when you refuse a flank and your opponent envelops around, force is going to be directed at one part of the line. Concentration of force destroys armies, so you need something that can resist concentration of force. And for 6 points, Tully Sworn shields are very durable. They have serviceable morale, they have 3+ saves and shield wall. I just really like them. Otherwise, across the course of the list, we have Rickard Karstark himself in a unit of Umber Greataxes. Now, I've played different variations of this list, I put him in some different configurations, but I have come to really like him in House Umber Greataxes. I actually don't mind him that much in the shields if you need to, because him being a Karstark unit will turn certain cards on a little bit better. But just looking at his abilities, he has Fueled by Slaughter. Fueled by Slaughter is amazing. Put him in Greataxes, because they will slaughter. He has performed very well in a couple of games in this configuration, and I really like it. Over here, we have a unit of Stark Bowmen with no trimmings. And then we have Rickon and Osha in a unit of whatever the melee Crannog unit that costs 7 points is called. I'm just going to call them Crannogman. This is a unit that I've had 3 games with now, and they have consistently impressed. Their kit is just super broad. They have Scout Openings, which is Draw a Mormont's Order, which is incredible on ranged units, particularly ranged units that ignore line of fire and hit on 3s. They have a Poison ability that's really cool. They can Swift Retreat, and they have just like okay kind of stats and the ability to weaken your opponent. They only have 5+ saves, but they have 5+ morale, so when you put Rickon and Osha in them, you end up with this unit that has 4+ morale, Stubborn Tenacity, Counter Strike, and weakens the enemy. That's excellent. Yeah, it's 8 points. It should be excellent, but it's just this kind of like polyvalent unit. It just does everything. On top of that, it buffs the rest of your army. There are very few things that they can't go one-on-one with through a combination of poisoning, weakening, running away from, counter-striking, wounding when they deal down, like wounding when they pass panic checks. It's just really nice, and they are further complemented with their 4+ morale by my NCUs. So not seen here, but my NCUs in this list, I only have 2, and I don't mind playing 3 NCUs with Starks. I think there's some good reason for it. But with Rickard, I'm usually not going to. Just for some extra flexibility with his, I think it's a Need for Vengeance card. I prefer to play him with 2. And so I've got Eddard Stark, 6 points, Warden of the North for healing and panic check rerolls. Excellent NCU, even after the 6-point increase to 6 points. And then Arya Stark. Now, Arya is essential. She's not only going to be essential in this matchup, but I'm playing an all-infantry army. And she is your mobility forgiveness for playing an army that otherwise cannot turn on a dime. In the same way that like Windermere gives you shifts in Greyjoys, and you really need that if you're playing all infantry, Starks are the faction of like just the best 6-point infantry, consistently like multiple excellent 6-point infantry options, and Arya lets you field them without having to pause and break into the cav. So, let's look at the table. In this game, I have remembered my rule of always making one side of the table better for another player. And for those who don't know why that is, it's just one of the worst things that can happen is that you make the table, just apart from the fact that it is boring for the table to just be completely even for the 2 players, if you set the table up so that one side is better, you are never going to be in a situation where your opponent wins the roll and you are immediately at a disadvantage. I always want the roll for first turn to not be an easy choice, because if the table is symmetrical, then you will always pick to choose initiative, whatever it is you want, whether you want to go first or second, because then your opponent has to pick a table side that doesn't matter, and they have to begin deploying first. And deploying first is a disadvantage, because your opponent will find it easier to counter-deploy. So in this case, what we've done is we put a forest across the middle, which I think serves my plan well. It will make the Tully Sworn shields even more difficult to shoot. It will not hinder my bowmen. We've got some bogs here, which Aaron placed, a corpse pile here, which Aaron placed, and then a weirwood here, which I placed, which really is hoping to only benefit one side of the table. The weirwood's aura kind of like extends around like this. It is not going to help units over here, and if I set the line of engagement there, it's basically the weirwood is going to be for me only. And that was, I mean, I would much rather have won the roll to make my opponent sit on a bad table side, but this deployment, this situation here serves me very well. In terms of our objectives, there are really only 2 important ones. This one will vulnerable things when scored, and this one will heal when scored, which is very nice. All of the rest are just when you control this, gain some crappy melee ability that doesn't matter. So that's deployment. The game is afoot. Let's snap forward. So first turn is the usual movement forward. We're going to just sort of describe what's happened, but then we're going to linger a little bit and just talk about playing into activation disadvantage. So as we can see, in this case, Aaron has elected to go first, so I will be the first player next turn. And we've seen some repositioning from the Greyjoys. The two melee units are staying in relatively close support and more or less outside of threat range. This is about 11 or 12 inches between the two sides. These archers have just moved up, and I have restricted my advance to a point where the bog is going to keep the archers from easily making shots into any of these units, even if Windermere allows them to shift forward. And I'm kind of pussyfooting around a little bit there. I don't want, because again, Aaron has 3 NCUs and I only have 2. I do not want Aaron to have an easy early shot on the first turn, particularly not into like my bowman or something. So just avoiding that to start with. If he wants to burn multiple Windermere tokens for that, that's an okay trade, and he doesn't. This bowman unit has begun the march down this direction with an aim eventually of sort of pivoting in and firing in enfilade up my lines, and then the cavalry have begun an 18-inch movement in this direction. This is the best color I have for this arrow, by the way. I'm doing my best here. Now, the cavalry would probably have liked to have repositioned a little bit more like down and around like that, but they, just in terms of the way the deployment worked, it didn't quite work out. Theon also potentially could have done the same, but again, the bowmen are kind of in his way. There was a potential at deployment, if Aaron had deployed a little differently, to kind of open up a wide flanking maneuver, and Theon is a commander that allows that to happen, but this list and Greyjoys generally are difficult to make that work in, because you're always going to have some infantry which will have to sort of stand in line and support one another. So what you want is you have Theon and you have these cavalry, which I do like in this list sort of conceptually, but they need to be the flanking force. And so they almost want to start like in the middle and then move out and around. And you want to fight sort of like a more standard infantry line otherwise. So for example, something like if we had along here, we had bowmen, Lysene, and then more bowmen, they could hold this position while Theon and the Cav begin this movement around here. Or you could do Horns of the Bull, which I think would work quite well here, where we would have archers there, and Theon there, and the cavalry there as their first 4 deployments, with the intention being that once your opponent's center of strength is revealed, you can then place down the Lysenes kind of as you want, and say this bowman unit would just play very non-committally, and this whole force begins to move in this direction in a very wide sweeping maneuver in order to render these pieces much less relevant. You'd almost cede the space in the center. But in this case, it's only the first turn, and we have these movements happening here, and I've moved up in basically a very concentrated force. So this sort of positioning here is really just to maintain distance from the bowman. We have my bowman up at the ready. We have the Crannogman at the ready. We have most aggressively postured is Rickard's unit, and then the shields just lined up, ready to... They might weather some flank fire, etc. Kind of importantly, Shaggydog has just moved in behind them. He can move in this direction or in this direction, but what he's doing right now is he's covering off his front. So even if something very weird happens with like Windermere shifts, it's not... I'm not even sure Windermere can shift cavalry, but anyway. It's these... The Shaggydog, he's got his front completely covered by the... center of mass completely covered by the Sworn Shield, so he won't get charged. So this is the status quo at the end of the first turn. I am about to go first next turn. And at this point, we need to talk about playing into activation disadvantage. And this is a really common thing in Song of Ice and Fire, where there's kind of like a broad meta consensus that 8 or 9, or basically more activations is always better. And we saw like some of the power of activation advantage in the free folk lists that I was playing. In previous battle reports, I'm very used to playing with many activations. And the advantage of having many activations is that at the end of any given round, you will have unopposed actions. And that also allows you to set up situations where, because Song of Ice and Fire is always alternating back and forth, I go first one round, you go first next round, it allows you to develop situations where you have the last action in a turn and the first action next turn. So you are trying, if you have activation advantage, to set up basically a series of concentrated actions that your opponent can't respond to, which gets you some advantage, whatever that might be. Usually it will be to overwhelm and destroy a unit, and so, for example, to overwhelm and destroy something like Tully Sworn Shields and proceed up the line with the advantage that you have gathered. Now, I have activation disadvantage in this game. I am playing 7 activations to my opponent's 8. My opponent will always have the last action in any given turn, and sometimes he will have the last 2 actions. I therefore have to play into an activation disadvantage. How do I do that? Well, to start with, I have 5 units rather than 4 with 3 NCUs, which means that although I had to deploy first, I had as many deployments as my opponent, which nullified to an extent my opponent's deployment advantage. That's something that I just find is useful. But otherwise, let's think about that whole activation advantage concept and how it's tried to make work. Activation advantage tends to materialize most heavily in like the early engagements of the game. No one is in contact yet. The beginning of the turn kind of does not matter a huge amount, but as things are forced to move forward into threat range, the person who has the most activations can stall out for the longest, they can wait, and they can launch an attack at the end of turn and potentially do something like make an attack, go first next turn, make an attack again. This is part of why you sometimes see people extol the virtues of 3 NCUs over 2 NCUs, because in this kind of situation here, having that extra NCU activation allows you to avoid committing to this advance forward just a little bit longer. And because you can avoid committing to an advance forward just a little bit longer, you can avoid a situation where your unit is the first unit exposed to harm. So we have that factor plus the activation advantage disadvantage situation. I need to, with 2 NCUs and an activation disadvantage, decide how I'm going to play into this. Let's pause in that and think about later in the game. Imagine we've got all of these units that are engaged. Tons of things are fighting. There's melee combats everywhere. Different things are moving around. And the fight is afoot. In this situation, if it can be engineered where the lines have all clashed, the person who has fewer activations doesn't have an advantage because they have fewer activations, but by definition, fewer activations will mean higher quality troops, which means that each individual activation will have more effect. My units are more dangerous than my opponents. When this unit of Greataxes takes a swing, you can bet that you will feel it more than when one of my opponent's units takes a swing. When this unit of Stark Archers fires, you can bet that it will do more damage than when this unit of Greyjoy Archers fires. He is firing 6 dice on 4s, I am firing 7 dice on 3s with some additional effect. Which means that the beginning of the turn, right, every individual action that I take is going to be doing slightly more than my opponent's, provided we are in contact with the enemy and doing things, which means that I am accruing advantage over the first part of the turn that my opponent is then hoping to recover over the second part of the turn. And the activation advantage disadvantage situation is much, much more, it favors the activation advantage player less, and that begins to swing even further if these activation qualities result in unit destruction before my opponent can activate them. So, early game, activation advantage provides comfort and will potentially set up a bottom of round, top of round engagement. Late game, when things are messier and there is more engagements happening, activation quality begins to show. So how do we play into activation disadvantage? Well, one way is to just be resilient. My opponent might get a bottom of round, top of round attack into a unit, but it's going to be into these Sworn Shields, who can probably deal with it. Yes, these guys will turn off the shield wall if they attack in the flank, but if they turn off the shield wall, then they're only a 6 dice attack. They're not getting their +1 dice in crit blow. Sworn Shields are tough. They'll probably be okay. The other thing that we can do is we can attempt to accelerate the game toward that messy engaged mid to late game state. Now that's often easier said than done, but I have Arya in the list. So let's see what happens. Oh wow, that looks messy, you might say. And yes, that is what I was going for. What the heck has happened here? This is a big difference from what we just saw. What we just saw was like 2 armies in line, basically like this. And now everything is a hot mess, and there's fewer Greyjoy units on the field than there were before. And that is because I have accelerated the game state, towards this position where things favor me. I'm actually going to jump back onto the previous slide and show you what happened. So from this situation here, I've used multiple Arya things. Firstly, I am going first, and I have a nice big unit of Stark Bowmen, and they are going to, off the swords, shoot into the Lysene Sellswords, and do like 6 wounds, 7 wounds. Very nice. Morale check failed. Excellent. That will also weaken this regiment and prevent them from activating Sentinel, but my plan is to drill them out. I think I did something like 7 wounds after the failed, or maybe 8 wounds after the failed morale check. My opponent takes the bags and heals them up a little bit, but on the turn he takes the bags, they move forward using Arya. So immediately we've got this unit of Crannogman here. I then activate the archers, activate the Crannogman's order, and then this is a 7 dice with precision and rerolls attack into this 5+, 7+ unit, and we just blow them out of the water. Now, I got marginally lucky to do that, but this firepower is just shredding them. This is exactly the kind of attack that you get out of scout openings in Stark Bowmen. If I'd been firing into a tougher unit, they would have survived, but precision would have mattered more. So immediately, we're 2 activations deep. What is Dead May Never Die has not been drawn yet because I took the letters on the first turn. Gone. Totally obliterated. I then use a second Arya token to move these guys up to here. Now I do this once this unit is destroyed. It's an opening that's been provided, but all of a sudden, like, okay, not only is my opponent beginning to lose their activation advantage, but they're pressed. Like, this is rough. Things are challenging. I am going to further attack into this. Like, I'm going to get the charge over here. My opponent is still trying to activate his NCUs. He's trying to claim zones to get things done. He's trying to use those NCUs to stall out the game. But the game is not willing to be stalled out at this point. Units are in charge distance of each other. Arya has forced a situation where you can't just do nothing. And so I'm getting charges, I'm putting poisoned and weakened into these between the letters and the attacks from the Crannogs. I even get, I think, an assault orders attack. Like, this is turned into a hot mess because I have radically accelerated the game state toward one that favors me. So just to jump back, we can see the fight that's ensued here is we've got Rickard Karstark versus the Theon's unit. Theon doesn't want to be in this melee. He's not terrible at taking this fight, but he wants to be working his way around, diversion tactics in, getting into place, and it's just, nope, now he's engaged with the toughest unit, in one of the most dangerous units in my army. The archers have managed to withdraw, but they are poisoned and weakened. Shaggydog has just moved all the way over here to score this objective because I didn't have anything on it. And then the Sworn Shields have moved up and rotated in this direction to avoid getting flank shot. I think they may have taken like 1 volley from some bowmen in a previous turn, and I just healed it back. They're totally fine. And then this fight here, this has been a back and forth melee. Both sides are attacking the other, but I've gotten a need for vengeance. No, Karstark Retribution onto Theon's unit, which means that every time Theon hits me, he's doing some panic damage. That's pretty good. He's vicious attacks. I mean, I'm trying to save on 4, so save on 4s, panic rolls on 7s, and every time I attack him, I'm rolling in with like 6 dice on 3s with big sundering. And if I do 4 wounds, which is very easy to do because he's vulnerable every time he attacks, I am recovering 4 wounds. I'm recovering 2 wounds from Karstark Retribution and 2 wounds from Fueled by Slaughter. And so this back and forth fight, like, this looks like, oh, okay, the Greataxes are winning. No, there have been multiple attacks here. Rickard has slammed into this melee, slammed back, like back and forth. I think we might have seen a We Do Not Sow. I've taken hits, he's taken hits, but I'm on full health because I just keep healing. Now, these bowmen have moved. The cavalry have just realized that like they're kind of out of position. They're going to move around this direction. Next turn, they'll make a run in this way, maybe try and close with the bowmen. But we can see, basically, like at this point here, we can see that the game state has just reached a pretty catastrophic position for the Greyjoys. My army is on full health. These bowmen are debilitated and shattered. This unit is weakened and has a very nasty debuff on them. These two units probably can't beat the Sworn Shields in a straight up fight. Sworn Shields are tough enough to hold against both of those until we get flank shots coming in, which will happen eventually. When my opponent begins his next turn, I play Karstark Retribution to take a free attack, and I use it to move the bowmen up and delete the archers. Well, not quite delete, but basically to bait out because I only need to do 6 wounds here. In fact, I don't even need to do 6 because I only need to really do like 4, and then the bowmen won't be able to do anything. I'm not actually 100% sure that was the right play. I think there's a very good argument really for taking the attack on with these guys, because these bowmen are in so much trouble. Like they're rooted. This attack here, Shaggydog if he needs to. These bowmen are never living the turn. I wanted to cement the advantage, and to an extent, I also wanted to test to see how good my sustain was. Now, the problem, quote unquote, with playing a Need for Vengeance is it's like Vargo Hote's card, where you get a free attack beginning of round, which is very strong as an ability. But your opponent then gets to activate an NCU immediately. And because Aaron had Peter Baelish, he could take a zone, treat it as the swords, and then take the swords. So this unit then got to double attack, not unopposed, not for free, because that was 2 NCU activations, but double attack, slam into this unit. And I think they did 8 wounds. I was burning a lot of Eddard tokens rerolling panic checks, and I was a little unlucky, but I managed to stave off the worst of the damage. Also, as this unit loses ranks, it takes less panic damage, which kind of helps. So that happened, but one of my rules with Rickard is the best time to play a Need for Vengeance is when you have assault orders in hand, because then your opponent will take zones that they want on the tactics board, but the zones that are left for you are still really, really good. So I play assault orders, and I swing back, and I get like a whole bunch of those wounds back. I think I did, because these Greataxes still have 5 dice on their lowest rank, and I might even have been on, I think, 5 troops after getting swung out a couple of times. I think it was minimum ranks. I swing back, I do 4 wounds, I heal back for 5 wounds. Right? 5 wounds sustained, cool, I'm now at nearly full operation, and I activate again, and I swing again, and he has a crack at me, I have a crack back, but as good as full pillage Reapers are, and the Reapers, will reach full pillage, and they will spend those tokens for healing, and like huge quantities of Windermere. Like the actual number of casualties that have been sustained is like on each of these units is going to be something like close to 16 to 20 wounds per unit by the time the fight is over. But just off the back of Fueled by Slaughter and a Karstark Retribution, I'm just up. I'm just up on the healing. These guys will never not do wounds, and the ranks are just thinning and thinning on the Greyjoys. And I eventually pull out, I force out a What is Dead May Never Die, and then I think I force out a second one. And I come through the fight with plenty of health. I've been using Eddard tokens to reroll panic checks to try and avoid those big panic bombs that the Reapers do, to some success, but it's ultimately a very good engagement. Unsurprisingly, the bowmen get kind of annihilated, and we will very quickly see this situation emerge. So here's the game state at its approximately terminal position. We've got a What is Dead May Never Die on the Reapers. We're occupying 3 of the 5 objectives, so I'm close to winning at this point. I've lost no units. We can see Rickard Karstark is at 2 ranks, which is good enough, and I'm going first. So I'm going to take the swords and swing and delete these guys again, pull the second What is Dead, heal up another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, reach full health. Like the sustain is unbearable. We will see this turn the cavalry charge around into the rear of the bowmen, and the bowmen will cop that. They'll take a whole bunch of wounds, I'll heal some back with Eddard, and I'll just retreat out of combat. All I need to do, really, there's nothing left in this Greyjoy force. We'll take some more sporadic firing shots into the Sworn Shields, but it doesn't matter. We've absolutely exploded through this flank. We've brought down Theon. Theon has been the recipient of all of the Greyjoy healing, and although there is a valiant attempt by the cavalry to break into the rear, it's not going to matter. I'm actually going to tick over to something like 12 points at the end of this turn, and that's going to be the game. So here we can see the end state, and just to add showboating injury to the entire thing, I've taunted this unit of archers into melee with Rickard. So rip the poor archers. Aaron isn't even able to pull them back onto this objective. There we go. So the game's going to end this turn something like 11-1. Haven't lost a unit. I've sustained through the entire fight, broken through, comfortably played into two NCUs to 3, no problem. 7 activations to 8, no problem. It's a question of having the tools to do it and to know how to do it. It's not always easy. If you don't build an army that can play into this kind of disadvantage, it's going to be very challenging. But having durability, sustain, and the ability to accelerate the game toward the mid game are all really helpful tools. Now, that said, Aaron obviously is a new player, and in terms of the list that he played, I like the concept that it's like playing to, but I don't think it was sort of hugely optimized. I think the NCU selection was totally fine. I would back all 3 of those NCUs, but if we go back to deployment, I think particularly the fragility of the Lysene Sellswords was really punishable. Putting 3 points of attachments into that unit, just no bueno. Give them maybe a 1-point attachment sometimes, but they realistically don't need support. They have plenty of dice, they have pillage. Like, the only thing I can think I might put into them kind of regularly, there's a few interesting and techie Greyjoy attachments, but the really obvious one would just be Asha, Captain of the Black Wind, to give them 5+ morale. Because what unit isn't she good in? She's fantastic. Best 1-point attachment in the game by a pretty comfortable margin, probably. That would help address their durability. It would have made them take 3 attacks to kill rather than 2. Obviously that's a useful change. And you can shift some things around. The 6-point light cavalry, the Bloody Mummers, I don't hate them. If you're going to use them anywhere, it is in Theon. They're a little bit of a meme. Like, this army has a lot of 5+ save, 7+ morale, etc. One of the things I think, if you're going to try out this kind of mobility force, if you're going to do this as a newer player, add just something that's durable, something that can anchor your line. And particularly with Theon, for example, with like diversion tactics, and you've got Sentinel in this list, having a unit that can take a punch just really helps. On top of that, having activation advantage doesn't change the fact that the game is still alternating activation, and that you have to do things in the 4th and the 5th and the 6th activation of a turn. And having a unit that's tough gives you, if you're trying to stall the game out and like be non-committal and punish your opponent for an overextension, having a unit that's durable enough to move forward means that you are not being punished in the early part of the game with all of your kind of fragile units. So, for example, I would, as much as I think 2-point Asha is a cool attachment, Sentinel and Gang Up are excellent, I think she probably needs to go out of this list, and you need to use one of those points to make one of the NCUs into Baron. If you have Baron Blacktide, probably the best 5-point NCU in the game, he can turn any of your units into that requisite anvil, because you will be able to absorb like 1 attack at least. That unit can then be the unit that moves forward first, which maybe will bait your opponent into an extension, will take damage, etc., enable you to trigger all of those different things, enable you to lock your opponent in place, and begin those wide sweeping maneuvers. So say we have, just as an example, we've got the Lysene Sellswords, maybe they're slightly more in the center. You've got Baron Blacktide, there's a 1-point attachment somewhere else in the list. They can now move forward, they can weather things like, a charge from the Greataxes. They won't like it, but they'll cop it. And you can free up Theon to begin these wide movements using enhanced mobility, and the Mummers to make these wide movements using enhanced mobility without the line crumpling. I was able to strike decisively using like Arya and ranged units and support from the Crannogs to really concentrate force into one part of the line. Let's remind ourselves, concentration of force destroys armies. I was able to concentrate a huge amount of force into one spot and basically seize territory that would win me the game, while good, independent, self-sufficient units then fought the rest of the Greyjoy army. If I was facing Baron Blacktide, I would not have been able to concentrate that force as effectively because my opponent could have put a strong resiliency effect on one of those units. So lots of ways that the game could have played out differently, lots of different things that could have happened. Some changes I would change mechanically, and some things I would just be aware of. I think Aaron is intended to watch this. He did ask for kind of like a report, my thoughts on the game. I have mostly spoken to what I did to deal with the problems that he was presenting. Hopefully this will provide something useful to him to think about how he can present those problems more effectively. In any case, it was a cracking Thursday evening game. Hope you enjoy this battle report and stay tuned for more Song of Ice and Fire Conquest and Infinity the Game battle reports in future.